Every country has stories, some are good and others are not. Bangladesh is not different. Bangladesh's economy was in bad shape at the time of its liberation in 1971, but within 5 decades of its birth, the country has transformed itself into an economic model for many small countries of the world. The journey has not been very smooth. Many socio-political and economic hurdles had to be crossed. Today we have Professor Rashid who will talk about the journey and the story of Bangladesh development. Professor Rashid.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's good that you are putting emphasis on Bangladesh, and there are series of discussion and interaction on Bangladesh. So it speaks the veracity of the interest as well as the necessity of having independent discussion on the growth path. Because in South Asian parlor, we always witness hype to hysteria. And that has unfortunately taken all those lamentations since the birth of Bangladesh. Some were eager to term it as a basket case. Others have termed it as a test case. And obviously, enthusiastically, some has gone to the level of calling it as a miracle. So, there are many different ways of looking at the story of Bangladesh, and obviously it requires passion and objectivity in understanding the case of Bangladesh, because Bangladeshis take pride that this is the country that has born out of bloodshed. So it is the single country in South Asia that was born out of war of liberation. So it's a story of people's struggle and people's aspiration. So we have to keep in mind why Bangladesh was created. And if one looks at we do not have, say, for example, Bill of Rights, but the Declaration of Independence says at least 3 pillars. These are equality, human dignity, and social justice. So in that narrative, one can really examine the half a century journey of Bangladesh. I would try to look at it in the prism of analyzing it in terms of necessary condition and the sufficient condition. So what economists would call that the necessary conditions are basically factors of production. So meaning land, labor, capital, and technology. And sufficient condition in my framework is political settlement. And there are varieties of discussion on political settlement. I would try to understand political settlement as understood in terms of power. And in my analysis, if the power is held by median population, then we could call it as a public society, and that society really can be understood in terms of aspiration of Bangladesh's war of liberation. So if we really look at the journey of Bangladesh, then one could come up with certain numbers. There are obviously debates about those numbers, but for the sake of the discussion, let's take the numbers that are produced by National Statistical Organization, BBS, Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics. Let's set aside the credibility aspects of it. One might ask many questions. So, the historiography is not known, but what we can do is come up with certain narratives based upon the evidence that we witness. So what we see in case of Bangladesh, that in terms of labor, that there is a gradual decline in poverty. But what we need to see is that in what phase and what speed and what velocity that decline has happened. So if we see that there has been a decline since 90s, but what we also see that the rate of decline has slowed down. Secondly, in terms of that, we see that there is a relationship between poverty as well as employment creation. So when we have the employment created, then the rate of decline was high. Then thirdly, we see that rate of return on labor, and if we are comparing vis-a-vis rate of return on capital, what we see that has increased in favor of capital. So which means that there is a gradual increase in inequality. Then if we are looking at capital as such, what we see that the rate of savings in gross domestic product is low. So is the ratio of investment in GDP is very low. So then question comes, what really sparked the growth rate? If you really look at, then you see that the consumption has remained the major source of the growth, which means that it has not led through investment, which is really a question mark. And that really begs question about the sustainability of the growth itself. So what is the source of consumption? If you really look at, it has really followed a very traditional way, which is that underemployed or unemployed labor from the rural areas came to city or went to mainly West Asia. So which had led, this internal migration has led to a kind of a wage laborer without having any other options. So which means that obviously the income has gone up, and that has increased certain degree of consumption. So it has remained consumption based, and that's why it is subject to risk. If there is an external shock, the economy, it's very difficult for the economy to absorb any external shock. And the classic example is COVID period. So which has, in absence of social security, universal social security, so what we have witnessed that there is a increase in new poor. And unfortunately, the current latest household income expenditure survey suggests that where there has been a huge investment relative to other divisions of the country, Dhaka has witnessed increase in poverty. So that also speaks of how if there is unemployment or non-voluntary unemployment, the weakness of not having a social security system which is plagued by exclusion and inclusion error, meaning that those who are supposed to be included in social safety nets programs, they are not included, and those who are not supposed to be included, they are included in the social safety net programs. And these social safety net programs are fragmented. Nobody can for sure say how many are. So some people would be saying it's 91, some people would be saying it's 112. And even when the Prime Minister wanted to provide cash assistance to 5 million people, in the absence of any list, they could only reach 3.5 million. So this social security program or universal social security program, or we do not even had any kind of thinking on life cycle based universal social security program. Then if you really move to the capital, then what we see an interesting phenomenon is that there is a concentration of income coming from a particular sector, which is ready-made garment industry. And this concentration is increasing every day. So there are a lot of talk about diversification, but hardly there is any effective step in terms of diversification, let alone talk about competitiveness. And more worrying is that there is a deindustrialization. And that too has contributed to the creation of new poor. Because why so? So the most of the people who are being employed are not being employed in formal sector. So most are employed in non-formal sector, almost 85% according to Bangladesh Bureau of Statistics. So obviously they are susceptible to any shock. And since there are negative employment in formal sector, so there is a premature deindustrialization. Deindustrialization might happen in advanced industrialized country. But what is worrying is that your ratio of investment to GDP has remained stagnant, particularly private sector, over the years, and recently it has declined. Gross savings has declined, domestic savings has declined, and so is the case with the investment and deindustrialization happening. And then obviously, if you really look at, Bangladesh is the largest supplier, has become the largest supplier in European Union in terms of ready-made garment industry. But if you really look at in terms of volume, it is the largest. But in terms of price, it's not the largest. So which means that the productivity gap, there is a productivity gap. So the technological acquisition or technological catching up has not taken the desired route. So that has created and that really brings to the if you are looking at that, okay, this is physical capital and this is human capital. So if you really look at the human capital formation, so what you always find, and this is interesting observation, that there is a mismatch between the supply side and the demand side. So while Bangladesh is ensuring its consumption-led growth by exporting human resources in West Asia and other countries, then due to lack of sufficient managerial capacity, Bangladesh has to import either through documented processes or undocumented processes, managers from other countries. So while there is a inflow, hard-earned inflow, and there is a outflow, because the university system or from primary to secondary to university system has not really been able to do its justice by providing skilled labor force or entering into innovation route. So which was supposed to be the case for universities and for others to really ensure that. So that has created a conundrum which is exhibited by different indexes that we see that compares different countries. So the capacity to absorb shock because of this level of human capital formation has really become an impediment to that process as well. And if we really look at the land, what we see that there is a fragmentation of land. It's not because because it's not driving out of any other processes, but essentially demographic processes. And when you have this land fragmentation, which means that would arrest the growth of productivity in agriculture, because your per acre cost becomes higher, so you don't have economies of scale, and simultaneously then you have other associated process of not functioning of markets with preponderance of intermediaries. So you see a difference between farm gate price and the retail price. And then thirdly, the agriculture faces, because agriculture requires constant innovation, and that too particularly has really become a major issue in the face of climate change, because you need to have innovation driven and processes, otherwise it's difficult to adjust to the climate processes. So what happens, that lack of economies of scale and the market failures has resulted into fall of productivity in agriculture. So what we have observed during this process is crop intensity, which means that earlier it used to be one crop, then it is now 3 crops, and that too has concentrated not in every aspects of agriculture, primarily cereal production and basically rice production. And you could see the dependence and market volatility in terms of different products, particularly rice, onion, or you would periodically witness the price volatility because of not having that kind of food security. And that really creates more issues, and that exacerbates inflationary pressure as well. And if the real wages do not go up, then if you are witnessing inflationary pressure, then your vulnerability increases. So then if you are moving into into the sectors for or in terms of finance. So basically, there has been an increase in internal resources. But as I said, that the internal resource mobilization has primarily rested on consumption-based tax, which is value-added tax. And despite many proclamations, income tax has never been the number one source of revenue. And it has remained, and if you really look at the tax GDP ratio, it's just above Afghanistan. So which means that there is a continuous dependence on loan, domestic loan, be it in external sources or internal sources. So because this part has not been there, and then obviously you need to finance your Bangladesh's infrastructure because it's required. So that has remained in most cases suppliers credit driven. So that accumulates loan, and if you really look at the credit scenario, external credit scenario, since independence to 2015 and 16, it was around $50 billion. And during the last 7 years, it's doubled. So, and you have a domestic situation, and then you have an external situation. So obviously, outflow would increase. And if there is a not net increase inflow, then that would hit balance of payment. I'll come to that later. So if we look at the infrastructure as a whole, and now gradually the country is exposed to from food insecurity to energy insecurity. What we seen that there was a nationalization of different gas fields. And then what we saw that there is a reversal of it, in the sense that yes, there is a higher installed capacity in terms of electricity. But electricity is a process. You need installation, then you need transmission, and you need distribution. So without transmission, if you have a higher installed capacity, you cannot you cannot reach, and that's why we have periodic load shedding. And secondly, what has happened that it is assumed that and this is where the lack of farsightedness in policy is so obvious. The policymakers have dependent that they would be depending on energy from as a basic source from the external sources without entering into any exploration activities. And that is why recent statistics would suggest that the capacity, particularly in terms of gas reserve has dwindled. and there is an increased LNG import. So that has created energy. Now I will come to this, why there is a balance of payment and why it has to go to IMF. So if you really look at the current statistics of Bangladesh, particularly last 2-3 years, we see a huge jump in import. Not the last year, but the year preceding last financial year. So there is a 35% jump in import. So if we are assuming that due to supply disruption, there has been an increase of, say, 10% rise in prices. So you can't tally with 35% increase. Or say, or if you really look at most of Bangladesh's import and export goes through Chattogram port. And if you really look at the papers over there, there is no change in volume. And if you really look at the data provided by National Board of Revenue and the central bank, which is called Bangladesh Bank, you see a huge discrepancies. So it indicates what has been argued by people who are observing in terms of illicit financial outflow, which is some estimates suggest that $57 billion. So that has never been investigated. And then just so that means that there is a over-investing case. And then if you really look at the just finished year, then you can't accommodate $9 to $12 billion between the figures of the National Board of Revenue and the figures of the Central Bank, Bangladesh Bank, in terms of export. You can't reconcile that. So the researchers who work on this illicit financial outflow has to be seriously investigated in order to understand, because of this huge lift, like a quantum lift in terms of outflow. So it means that that there is a outflow, capital flight, and the reserve situation can't be blamed to Ukraine war, because it has started to decline before the Ukraine war. So there is a outflow in terms of that. And then, so what happens? So current account, export, import, the current, you see there is a suppression of import. But there is no quantum jump in import. So obviously current account, there is a negative current account balance. But that has a consequences, which is that if the capital machinery and intermediate goods import is declining, then obviously final good export would have an impact. So that's on the current account. And remittance inflow has not increased to that level which can reduce the current account deficit. But what is worrying is that in terms of financial account, because of the debt, now it is debt payment, so it is going out. So they recently decided that these foreign reserves has to be $24 billion. So it has not been achieved by the central bank, because it's very difficult given the capital flight and given the condition with regard to loan repayment. So what is creating that, because there is a dollar crisis, so that is hampering on the import, so would have a cascading effect on the production capacity, and already there is a deindustrialization. So that's one part. Second part is about the domestic resource mobilization. There has been government statistics suggest that there is, if you look at the ratio of tax GDP, it has also declined. So while your principal and interest payment has gone up and the tax GDP ratio has gone down, so you end up in a widening deficit, and that has two distinctive impact. One is the capacity for the government to finance investment projects, or the capacity for the government to ensure human capital formation, or capacity of the government to address the inflation crisis reduces given the reduction in government's capacity to mobilize revenue. So that's a kind of a part that we know in terms of variables economics could produce, and I'm sure there are many political scientists here. It's very difficult for us as an economist to really relate that, because how do we find the causation? Because without any causation, we can't really say that has a implications, because mere correlation cannot allow you to establish a causation, and without really a causation, you can't really make a narrative. So if we really look at the evidence, it allows us to infer certain certain stories. So if we really look at the poverty, so when there is and one has to, I'm not going into democracy or that is not our cup of tea. That's political scientists has to address. But what is required, that we understand that getting price right is not the solution. Getting an institution right is the solution, because the history and there is a realization that economic outcome is not necessarily because of the factors of production. Non-economic factors has an impact on the input itself, and there is a growing recognition for it. So that may take either, if you want to call it order, or if you want to call it rules, or if you want to call it norms, or if you want to call it values. And interestingly, the informal institutions like norms and values has more profound impact than the rule or organization itself, meaning formal institutions. So I'll delineate certain and what the evidence we can establish. So if you really look at the poverty condition, then you see that when there was a kind of a competitive clientelism, you see the rate of decline is higher. So that's between 1991 to 2006. And if you really look at the employment creation, then you would also see that these are positively correlated. Because that's what evidence suggests. Then if you really look at non-performing loan and concentration of loan, or having a kind of a unique situation where a group owns, say, 8 banks. So huge centralization of capital, it's not monopoly, it's not oligopoly. One has to really be careful about it. Because you can address monopoly and oligopoly, it's not state capture, it's primitive accumulation in its wildest form. Because if you really look at the ratio of increase of non-performing loan, if we are looking at the velocity of it, it is increasing like the acceleration is so at a speed, and now it end up that some of the banks are surviving by borrowing from the central bank. Because if it is a monopoly or oligopoly, what would happen? There would have been a merger and acquisition. But what happens that if a bank has not performed, then you rename it and you allow it to continue. But there should have been a collapse of that bank because it's not too big to fall. You allow Lehman Brothers to fall, but you don't allow Freddie Mae to fall. So there are banks which is not that share in the industry itself that you can't really allow it to fall. So that's another, and it's really so it is creating a problem of like a monster. And you have seen newspaper reports. I don't want to get into this because that is something job of the journalist. But what we can get into is that, and why I am calling it primitive accumulation, because we have to really answer that question. So this is coming from the state. State is constantly defining and redefining through legal means, meaning what is default. So central bank is coming up with all those definitions, giving all those waivers, but it is increasing at an increasing rate. Or those laws, banking laws, are changed in terms of either who could be the directors, what constitutes a family, or now the latest one is really interesting. Earlier the one was like that, from a group, if one defaults, then other can't borrow. Now it is saying, okay, you won all those entities, but that one has defaulted, but that one you can borrow.
Please
huh? Okay. So thank you for. So the last point I would like to go. So that's the second one, and the third one, the energy security. Because what I'm saying, this insecurity has a direct bearing coming from the political settlement. So if you really look at the energy security, you don't have to produce, but you could get billions. as a capacity charge. And that is protected under the law. Because rental and quick rental, you can't really, you cannot take it into the court of law. So there is an indemnity. And if you really look at the Bangladesh Power Development Board, which buys all electricity, and if you look at their balance sheet, what you see that 50% power are bought from the independent powers, but 70% are spent on them. So that allows you to understand that these form of clientelism has really created a situation which has become sources of not, if you are looking at risk, no, not stress, not vulnerability, but a cycle of insecurity, which Bangladesh doesn't deserve. Because if you really look at the kind of enthusiasm, the kind of interest, because they are interested in breaking the barriers, but unfortunately the political settlement they are in, which results economic insecurity. And so the issue that has become really a cause for concern is rent. Meaning, as you understand, that unearned income without being in production. So it has, I do not know, but I'm not saying it is to the equivalent of Louis XVI. But this is really has created a situation where rentier distribution, and this has created a sense of delegatory framework. So there is a vertically there is a link, and horizontally they are linked. Meaning horizontal link are businessman, politician, and bureaucracy. And there is a kind of a domain that who would get what. So you can't really just reduce it in terms of corruption. So this rent, which would have, if it would have been a reverse thing, that could lead to a huge potential. Say, for example, you give a rent to an energy company, and after a while, if that energy company gets the capacity to explore a gas field, then that's a productive rent, which is the story of development. So either you call it incentive or what, but to me that rent, productive rent, is essential. And productive rent in terms of public finance is essential. So the public society, as opposed to this concentrated form of clientelism, which is eating out the rent and creating the scenario which is undesirable. And that is a crossroad Bangladesh is in. So shall I stop here?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for making such a wonderful presentation. I hope people have questions. So before I open the floor, as you have written lots of things on environment issue and climate change and ecosystem, Sundarban ecosystem. So my question is that how the climate change, what's the impact of climate change on Bangladesh infrastructure?
Shall we take
a
few
questions first?
And then I'll...
Could I ask?
Please, the chair.
Yes, so I had a question. Unemployment did not sort of figure in your wide-ranging talk. Could you sort of shed some light on what the unemployment as well as underemployment numbers might mean, and whether it has any impact on the, you talked a little bit about the stability, yes, I'm assuming political stability, because just if you look at India, there are unemployment numbers are higher, but also underemployment, but that has not had an impact, at least for the last decade or so, even longer, on the sort of political outcome. So maybe if you can just talk, because large unemployment numbers does pose a threat to stability.
Yeah, I also have a question. You mentioned deindustrialization and stagnation of the manufacturing to GDP ratio over decades, and this is something that is true for Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Why it is?
Okay.
I have a question. In the title you have,
I'll go after
you
this
have
three.
political settlement, but you didn't discuss political settlement in your talk at all. You just discussed the macroeconomic features of Bangladesh. Right. So half your talk, apparently, I don't know, maybe I missed something, but I didn't see it.
Okay. Okay. So I'll answer these three first. Then next round I'll go to about political settlement. On the climate issue, you could easily see there are two issues that really relates to the political settlement as well. How? Say, for example, we have witnessing the frequency of cyclones. So that, according to IPCC, that is an indication of climate change, right? And then we see that there is a lesser amount of casualty, right? So what this means that due to particular geospatial location, because if there is a cyclone in, say, Caribbean, and if there is a cyclone in Bangladesh, the devastation would be very high in Bangladesh because it's funnel shaped. So it would really create, the velocity would be very high. So it would have a higher intensity, right? So even then, why it's not that high? Because there is a natural wall called Sundarbans. So Bangladesh is champion in saying that we are a climate vulnerable country, and secondly, there is an agreement that we must move from fossil fuel. But unfortunately, we are having coal-fired power plant within the ecological critical area of Sundarbans. So while we are at the global level suggesting that there is and then we are engaged, and if you really look at the rate of progress in renewable energy, that doesn't speaks of the requirement or the country that is a victim of climate change. So which means that the political settlement, because either you produce or not produce, two things are sure. One, you would be getting because most of it is done by supplier's credit, and they are getting their money returned, no matter which blocks you are in, and you are getting. Even sometimes the government is, in recent times, they have not been able to pay them on a regular basis because of the currency crisis. But having said that they are But what is really moot question are two, that these processes has resulted serious food insecurity. And if you really visit Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world, then you would find in the vicinity, nobody can really drink that water. It is so saline prone. And if you really look at the impact on women, because they have to face the water, from that micro level to the macro level to the meta level, you could see that the visible impact of climate change. And that requires a huge research and development expenditure. Because agriculture, you can't really have an agriculture without a huge public investment in agriculture. But having said, there is a kind of, other than in relation to other organization, agriculture research system is not that too bad. But that requires huge public investment. But that's not there. Then there is no increase in this renewable energy. Say, for example, when we are having this load shedding, easily you can double the capacity of in terms of solar because that would solve the foreign exchange question, as well as that could really ensure our electricity. But that has not been the case. In terms of employment, you can't really compare Bangladesh with India. One thing you can compare, like when you have this sample survey, so there are cooked figures, but there some were so man of integrity, they resigned in Indian case. But you in India there is a public food distribution system, right? And during the COVID, there were many initiatives coming from the government. So and then I don't know how it worked, but why they have not really this program rural employment guarantee scheme, Mahatma Gandhi rural employment. I'm sorry, I forgot the name. Narega, yes, Narega. So that's it. There is a public into it. But here, because of the World Bank liberalization drive, they have dismantled the public food distribution system. But that has not been dismantled in India. So that's one aspect of it. But definitely, this is a real issue that requires deeper understanding. As you rightly mentioned, that why deindustrialization, premature deindustrialization is there in Indian subcontinent. And that's a real issue. Danny Roderick goes on to ask that question, and he becomes quite pessimistic about India's growth rate, which is because if the return on capital would be so less, then there would be lesser savings, and obviously that would not allow the investment to go up, and that's a cycle, and that really requires a serious analysis of it. And I entirely agree with you that that's an area it's happening. The political settlement, as I said, the way I looked at political settlement is in terms of power and concentration of power. So if that is a static concept, then in my idea, what would be then, and if that is a comparative statics, what would be the dynamics? So what I understood, that if there is a median population is power is with the median population, then you have a political settlement that would allow you to have a rent distributed to the productive sector. On the contrary, if this power is concentrated concentrated in either way, then you have a rentier society, and that is happening in Bangladesh. And the only decolonized country which was very successful, which is USA, has seen that when because if you really look at least you see two distinctive phases. One distinctive phase is the age of reform, pre First World War II, and before that there is a wilderness, and then post Second World War you see age of rights with FDR, and before that Lincoln. So and then you can also see in European context, you can see in a different context in Chinese context. So that is why I am saying that if the median population are powerless, then you have a situation which could lead to economic outcome which would always have, it would start deceleration, then decline. So that's my kind of understanding.
Question. Professor, I would like to know, you mentioned you are observing more a case of primitive accumulation rather than oligarchy. I don't come from an economics background, so that's why I'm asking, is it possible that the two of them can coexist? It is a case of primitive accumulation.
I don't want to get into your terrain. You see, what I am trying to understand, I looked at very simply, and please allow me if I am wrong, forgive me. So I understood what is a state. So I take from Max Weber that which has a legitimate monopoly of violence. So I see if the concentration of power can create violence either in any form or shape, that is the issue. So that is why I am calling it primitive accumulation. So it is power, and power taking the shape of a violence, because it has monopoly of violence, and that violence is unleashed in terms of distribution of rent. This is how. So I make a distinction, and we can discuss about it, but given the time, why it is not neo-patrimonialism, why it is not crony capitalism, why it is primitive accumulation. Because I see it as a state, this is done by the state itself. So the state has the only power, which is violence. So even if you really look at, we may not agree on that issue, but even if you look at Douglas North and others work on social order and violence, you would see that in his articulation of limited access order and open access order, he goes by that. But that has a huge problem that I don't want to. So that's why I was going through a historical institutional route where I was giving you the example of USA, that how it has shaped. So there is always a constructive ambiguity. But what we need to be sure that this is the power of the state. And the state has only one power, which is violence, capacity to violence. So these rent distribution originates from that. That is my way of interpretation. But I essentially look forward to having an engagement and conversation with the political scientists.
If we have time, I have another question. You know, you
Don't bog me down.
no, your macroeconomic. So growth is driven by investment. Absolutely agree with that. So here's the question, and linked to political settlement, if the rentier seeking class around it. I feel, the Bangladeshi entrepreneurs and Bangladeshi enterprises are vastly undervalued in the light of the international capital market. And Bangladesh's GDP is $420 billion, not a small economy. GDP is $1.2 trillion, not a small economy, 180 million people. So if we allow the inflow of international capital in the productive sector to drive investments, I think that's a solution to all the problems you stated. For the next 10 years, not for
I couldn't agree more with you. In our ways, I have done with a colleague. So we model in terms of Bangladesh's possibilities. So earlier, our model suggested that it was like by 2035, Bangladesh would reach $1 trillion economy. But our current estimates suggest that Bangladesh can achieve from its almost $500 billion to $1 trillion economy by 2033. And I'm quite hopeful, and you are right. And that is why, as I said, and thank you for rounding the discussion as I started from that. So I am quite hopeful. If public society, there is a semblance of public society which is contingent upon political settlement. If these how do I say, if this guillotine of this concentration of power really starts unlocking, then Bangladesh could achieve $1 trillion economy. Yes, that might not lead to the 2041 because it's $5,000 per person, which is not that high, but that is obviously a something to reckon with. And I also believe, and that's my firm belief. I think that Bangladesh can, given its capabilities, and there could be many firms which could be listed in New York Times. Because as I say, I have outlined in my presentation the causation framework, and all are identified that what is causing this deceleration or what is causing this decline. So it is identified. If there is a kind of an understanding or an investigation which gives signals to the market that, because what you have seen, and this is really ludicrous in the sense that British East India Company took the money and had their industrialization. While we are witnessing, these rentiers are siphoning off countries' wealth, and on the one hand, and there is a deindustrialization taking place. And interestingly, another political settlement idea would be, look at every collectorate of the British India Company were really achieving their target. But having been an independent and national board of revenue, they are not being able to achieve the target of internal resource mobilization. I was looking at Singapore's founding prime minister's speech, I think in it would be 1974 or 5, where he was referring to the Times of London, where he was saying that he was obviously in his own style and tone and tenure. He was saying about Bangladesh's case and the report done in that newspaper, where he was saying that you have to deal with it. So the causation of deceleration and decline are identified. And that is where the political settlement comes in. And this economy, it's not we are running fancy models, but all are, because if you really look at the economically active population, because as I outlined that the growth has come from because of this wage, right? Migration. So given that, it's really an economy that would be what could be pursued by many other countries, but contingent upon the political settlement.
Since we don't have any other questions, so it's fair to thank you, Professor, for a wonderful talk. And we hope to see you again in next ISAS class. Thanks.
Thank you for hosting me. I was expecting that you would be cut into pieces by political scientists. Thank God you have saved me.